different thing. But Wilhelm, you're very welcome. The topic that Wilhelm's going to speak to is Beyond Rainbow-ism, White Restitutional Responsibility and the Black Christ. So if there ever was a provocative, if what, somewhat esoteric title, that is it, and we really look forward to hearing. Thanks, Wilhelm.
Good evening. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you for this welcome. It is a reflection, I think, of my experience of the realities in South Africa. I was away for, let's say, a decade and returned in 2012. And it's one of the disturbing sort of developments is really a new generation of young people who have come through the transition period and are now starting to ask some very difficult questions. And it's disturbing in the sense that it's good because there's disturbance necessary, but it's also disturbing for people from my generation when you hear a young person, young black South African say that Nelson Mandela was a sellout. When they say Archbishop Tutu, who's well known for his metaphor of South Africa as the rainbow nation, that he's also being questioned for not actually being radical enough. And for people who've lived through that time, I think it's quite difficult to convey to a younger generation today just what the constraints were, what the conditions were. But the reality we face in South Africa is that we are still, I think, the most unequal society in the world, very much racialized in terms of the poverty and the inequality. And increasingly people become, especially in the black community, very skeptical when you have white South Africans using the language of reconciliation. And appropriating, the language and the images and the metaphors used by Archbishop Tutu and former President Mandela, and saying that this really is a kind of superficial romanticism. It's not dealing with the real issues, and that's where this notion, I think, of rainbow-ism, like the way in which white South Africans, after the storms of apartheid, have enjoyed the sort of the glow of the rainbow, but haven't really done enough to address our responsibility to deal with the legacy and the damage caused by that storm. So this is really what is the kind of the broad background. I've also been on a bit of a journey to try and make sense where I fit into the current transition as a white Afrikaans-speaking South African from a sort of middle-class background, but also from a specific cultural and family background. Where do I fit into this current transition, and where can I play a role from a facilitation point of view in terms of changing this legacy of apartheid? And so I've been on a bit of a journey, and on this journey, I've come across this image, which is known as the Black Christ. It's one of the first pieces of protest art painted by an amateur artist, in his early 20s, in the early 60s. At the time when apartheid was really at its heyday, the system of racial separation that we've had in South Africa until 1994, starting in 1948, in terms of that particular variation on colonialist segregation. So this was painted in the early 60s by a young person of color, and he was looking for a way to express his anger, his frustration, his sense of injustice about what was being done to black South Africans under that particular regime. And he ended up using as a Christ figure, which was very provocative at that time, in the context of a government, a regime that used a lot of Christian rhetoric to even justify what was being done. So he prophetically placed a black South African figure in the Christ position. And the person which is represented there is Chief Albert Luthuli. It might not be a name that you're familiar with, but he was the president of the ANC in the 60s. He also was the first South African to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. So he was an internationally recognized figure, and so he became almost like also a father figure for the young painter, and he chose Chief Luthuli as a symbolic representation of what white South Africans, what the apartheid system was doing to black South Africans, in the name of Christianity often. Some of the other figures on the left at the top there is the Minister of Police, John Foster, and then the Prime Minister, H.F. Verwoerd in the bottom there, in the figure of the Roman centurion piercing the side of Christ. And he chose those figures because they were representing the system at the time for him as people who were really politically also leaders who are responsible for what was happening. The two figures on the right are sort of representative figures. It's not very clear in the painting, but it's supposed to be Mary and John. But he tried to present somebody who has Asian features and somebody who was colored, as we would say, a person of mixed race. So he was trying to draw them also into the story of what was being done to people of all colors, of people who were not white. So just to, I suppose, to remind myself, but also to remind people who might not be so clear with our memories about why that is kind of a prophetic, symbolic presentation. I'm just using a few images from that time. I mean, this is a very iconic image from the 1970s, and it's the kind of image that many people would associate with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Exposing or putting into the forefront cases of people being killed by the previous state. But actually what I find even more important are these images, well, not more important, but to complement the more visible physical violence that took place. I'm increasingly, concerned that what we actually did during the transition was to actually focus too much on certain categories of violations, but we neglected the systemic nature of the system. The ways in which, this is an image of forced removals. Millions of people were forcibly removed in terms of the racial classification system, moved into areas outside the white-controlled cities where people couldn't own property or own land. 87% of the land was basically in the hands of white South Africans, and people working in the cities were supposed to find their homes, their citizenship in what was called homelands on the margins of so-called white South Africa. And it affected millions and millions of people. The passes, this came in, the pass laws were there in terms of controlling the migrant labor system. That was really part of the British colonial system, but it was given an edge in the 50s when they also applied that to women. So men were allowed to come in and work on the mines, say in Johannesburg, Pretoria, those places, but women were not technically supposed to be there, but increasingly they also tried to control the movement of women. And so this became a very strong resistance movement really amongst the women in the 50s to stop also them from carrying passes, because the pass determined really where you could be and where you could work. And if you didn't have the right pass, you would be taken back or forced back to go to kind of a remote rural area that was supposed to be your home. And it disrupted families, it destroyed people's ability to earn any income. So that's something about the system. Why was it associated with Verwoerd as the Prime Minister? This gives you a feeling for it. I interviewed this person, he's called Dudley Adolf. I got to know him recently, the last few years. And he just reflected back to that time. Verwoerd in our township was like a swear name. We would refer to him as a dog. Because of Verwoerd, look at these conditions. Because of Verwoerd. But you didn't dare say anything against him because you were fearful of the security police. Everybody knew who killed him. I remember when he was stabbed. It was like a big party. And that's what he said. And the reason why I suppose that was a bit difficult for me to accept was that this person in the bottom corner was not only the Prime Minister, he was also my grandfather. So this is a very different image, a family image of Prime Minister H.F. Verwoerd and his wife, my grandmother Betsy. The grandchildren sitting on the stoep or the veranda of the Prime Minister's house at the time in 1964. And what I find very, very interesting is that the little person sitting on his lap, literally, happens to be me. And I was very struck by this fact. When I looked on the one hand at this image of the Black Christ, and the representation of the person associated with that system. And then looking at this image of the family and the grandchildren, and then ending up with an image sitting literally on his lap and being given milk. it's almost like a maternal kind of image that you don't associate with somebody who was seen as the man of granite, the person who was rock-like in his defense of this ideology of separate development at that time, and was a hated figure within the broader black community, as you saw from that quote. But in my family, in my community, the Afrikaans-speaking white community, he was seen as a hero. He was seen as a wonderful kind of family man, a leader of our group, and he was seen as somebody who brought us, in terms of the Afrikaner community, our political freedom in our struggle with the English-speaking white South Africans. Because under his leadership in 1961, South Africa became a republic outside the British Commonwealth. And that was seen as the achievement of an ideal that started 100 years before, when the Transvaal and the Free State became independent Boer republics. And during the Anglo-Boer War, or the South African War, we lost that community, lost control of those provinces in that very terrible war, the Anglo-Boer War, the South African War. So when in 1960, South Africa achieved this goal of becoming a republic from a white Afrikaans point of view, he was credited as playing a very important role in that process. And that's why he was revered. I think what makes it difficult for many people, and it sort of was alluded to in that quote, and I think why many people in the Afrikaans community, and even in my own family, prefers to look at this image and not at the Black Christ painting, is also because of what happened to him. Now, this is a bit of a strange exhibition, but it's part of a Verwoerd memorial house in this sort of one part of the country, and it's actually an exhibition of the clothes that he wore on the day that he was assassinated in Parliament in 1966, just 2 years after that photo. I find it a bit strange that people end up, exhibiting this. But I think what it does is it conveys something about how within my own family, but also within the Afrikaner community, people saw his death as a sacrifice that contributed to the consolidation of this idea of South Africa as a republic. And the fact that he gave his life, the fact that he gave his lifeblood for the cause of his community, gave a certain meaning to his death, which created almost like what I think, Brandon, what you call this idea of a sacred bond almost with the dead. And that so for me to actually talk about him as the architect of apartheid or the soldier with the spear comes across in my family and in my community as almost, betrayal, as disrespectful, as not honoring this sacred bond with a grandfather, with a national leader who gave his life in the service of his group. And so what you end up with is really, for me, a kind of irreconcilable tension between those two images. Especially if I go into the memories and I go into the stories of my father's and my mother's generation, and we talk about what happened during the 60s, and we go into the detail of what happened on the day when he was assassinated, then they like to look at that image. That's the image that they still want to treasure. When I talk about this image, the Black Christ painting, there's a visceral anger. Even in the 60s, when this was painted, very quickly it was declared as blasphemous by the Dutch Reformed Church, which was like the state Afrikaner church. Very quickly, the painter was arrested by the security police and was brutally tortured to find this painting, because they knew that something was going to happen, and they managed to smuggle the painting out, and it ended up in England and was used as part of the anti-apartheid movement to raise funds for the struggle against apartheid. And it only returned like in the 1997, 98. And even then, when I looked at that image, there was a part of me that struggled to really look at it. Not just as a painting, but as an icon, in the sense of almost like a spiritual icon, something that opens up a window on a world that I have to face. So to come back to the theme of responsibility, really, I mean, I'm just using this almost to frame, why this question of white responsibility is so contested within the community that I'm from and within the broader white South African community. And why so many people with my background, with my skin color, struggle to actually face the truth of what is conveyed in that painting. And so what I want to do is just reflect a bit on what is going on here. Why is there this resistance, this reluctance for people to take on a sense of shared responsibility for something that was clearly accepted as wrong, as a system of systematic racial discrimination. The benefits, the legacy of that system is very clearly visible. But somehow we've moved into a phase in the South African transition where people are finding it difficult to actually even talk about that, and definitely finding it difficult to face that sense of historical responsibility. And I'm intrigued by what is going on here, and I'm looking for creative ways to transform some of that resistance to restitutional responsibility, because I see around me, and when I'm engaging with Black South Africans or people of color in South Africa, I see how that reluctance, that resistance to take responsibility is being perceived as avoidance, indifference, denial, and it's like salt being rubbed into the wounds of people who are still struggling as a result of that system. So by not taking responsibility, we're not keeping things as they are, we're actually making things worse. We're adding salt to the wounds of so many people. So it becomes quite important to make sense of what is going on here. So I just want to say a few things, and I want to make sure that there's enough time also for people to ask questions and explore further with me what you want to explore. But the first thing I want to say is that why I like this particular symbolic representation of what went on during that system is because it has a certain depth to it. I mean, it's relatively straightforward, it's relatively visible when you look around you in South Africa, and definitely when you go back historically, to see the effectiveness of forced removals, to see how communities are still very clearly segregated along racial lines, to see very clearly the different levels of poverty and privilege. So that's very difficult to deny that reality. But my worry is that quite a few people look at that more from a kind of, let's say, a political point of view. And where people might say, we accept that system didn't work, or we accept that system was wrong. But we need a democracy, we need a different kind of South Africa. But they haven't gone much beyond that. There hasn't been, in my experience, enough people who have engaged with the depth of what is conveyed by that image. Because we're not only talking about a political system of dehumanization. We're talking about a moral, a deeply immoral system, and you could even go further and say there was a spiritual violation in terms of our deepest human dignity. That was that took place. And in a community that I'm from, where there's still a lot of people who, I suppose, who would see themselves as Christian, many people still belong to Christian denominations, I think it's very important to hold on to this kind of image and say, we need to face the truth of what is being conveyed here. The painter never suggested that Albert Lutuli was Jesus, or he was not trying to replace the Jesus character, but what he was trying to say was what we were doing to fellow South Africans is like what was done to Christ. It was trying to make that connection, and almost like to shock people to a realization of the depth of the wounding that took place. Archbishop Tutu, in one of his, I think in his preface to Steve Biko's book, I Write What I Like, talks about perhaps the greatest crime, the biggest violation of the apartheid system was that it got to the point where it made many Black South Africans doubt the fact that they are children of God, with dignity and equality in terms of their humanity. So trying to get to that depth, I think for me, is part of what's needed, and that's for me represented by that image. Looking at the the figure in the bottom corner, the Verwoerd personification, leaving for a moment the grandfather out of the equation, at least emotionally. To actually look at that image, what's interesting for me is that you have a relatively youthful body. Like if you look at the actual way in which the painter presented the figure, it's got a relatively youthful, kind of quite muscular body associated more with a soldier, I suppose. But it's got the face of an older political leader. And I like that combination, if you think about it metaphorically. Because it's been quite tempting during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission period for people in the broader system of the apartheid system to point fingers at the police and the military and the security police who enacted the system, to say these are the people that actually should get amnesty, these are the people that were the perpetrators. But what that image does, I think, is to actually say this was part of a political system. This wasn't just a number of random police and security and army people who committed those violations. It was part of a system of systematic racial dehumanization. I like the length of the spear as well. The fact that actually if you look back at that system and you think of all the people who were involved in the implementation also of the bureaucracy, if you think of the churches and the ways in which, especially in the white community, they justified theologically that system. You think of the education system. You think of the business communities, not only in the Afrikaans-speaking community, but also in the English-speaking white community. There were increasing numbers of people who supported the National Party during the 60s. And that continued into the 70s and 80s as it became more and more a security state. So often these days you hear English-speaking white South Africans being quite willing to speak about apartheid and being quite willing to speak about the role of Afrikaners, the Boere, in that system. But they often are not willing to speak about their own complicity in terms of supporting and economically upholding and definitely benefiting from that system. So I like to just remember the length of that spear. And to then actually say to myself, okay, I can perhaps need to go back to that image on the left and acknowledge the fact that in some ways my grandfather is also in me, well, literally, genetically speaking. But in terms of the image of the mother's milk, what you receive culturally also intergenerationally, that I also need to accept that in some sense I'm also holding that spear. That I definitely supported that system during up to my early 20s. I voted, in explicit ways I supported that system. So I have to accept that I'm also holding that spear, even though I'm from a slightly later generation. So that's one obvious way, I think, in terms of thinking of responsibility. That's the way people often speak about it. Whether you've actually causally contributed and whether you've intended, to contribute to something. So that's one way to speak about the kind of shared responsibility and to acknowledge that I'm also part of that image, that I cannot deny my participation in that crucifixion. The one that I find more challenging and that many other people are struggling with is to say, even if I didn't directly contribute, so even if you think about some of the younger people today who were not present at the time that the system was being implemented, but who are clearly still benefiting from that system, what is your responsibility? So there's a whole question around being a beneficiary across generations, and in what sense can you take some sense of shared responsibility to do something with those benefits? Not out of charity, not out of sort of helping the poor, but out of an acceptance of shared responsibility, which brings a much more equal moral dynamic into the relationship. So that's another way to speak about shared responsibility. And then there's a third way, which is the one that I've experienced again and again in the last few years, and I would call it probably some kind of a representational responsibility, or representative, of a representing kind of responsibility. Because what I find when I go into a space and I engage with, say, a group of Black South Africans, and they see my skin color, it brings up memories and associations with what that whiteness represents. Okay, what they associate with what other white people have done to them, what their experiences have been, and with the police, and broadly speaking, with basically a system which turned Jesus into a white god. Because Jesus was a member of my church, when I grew up. So to actually, acknowledge that whiteness has as many layers of meaning for people when they just see the color of my skin. When they hear my surname, and they realize that I'm the grandson of H.F. Verwoerd, then there's additional emotion and anger and caution that comes into the relationship. Because in some sense, especially in the broader black community where people have a very strong sense of family and a very strong sense of ancestors and the living presence of ancestors in our relationships, there's a sense in which my presence brings him into the space. In some sense, I'm bringing him into the present in a very, often quite visceral way. And I've seen this again and again and again, that the association, the connection that I have from an identity point of view, from a relational point of view, brings an energy, brings a dynamic into the space. And I think it applies to any white South African, but there's a bit of extra charge, a bit of extra energy, I think, because of the connection with somebody seen as the leader and as a representative of the system. So what do I do with that energy? Some people say to me, be careful, don't take on too much responsibility. Your grandfather did what he did, you didn't do it, get on with your life, don't allow yourself to be overwhelmed by this responsibility. And there's some truth in that. But what I've also seen is, if I actually accept that representational responsibility, accept this is what is happening in this space, and that it's I have the ability to respond to that in a creative way, in an acknowledging, humble way, instead of denying, instead of trying to avoid responsibility. And by accepting, by acknowledging that in some sense I am representing this person associated with so much pain, something happens in that relationship. Beyond me as an individual, beyond what I deserve. There's something symbolic, something human happening there. And I often find people, after a bit of interaction, and once they've heard that I'm not trying to defend, that I'm willing to listen to the pain, that I'm willing to acknowledge, that there's a kind of a warmth that starts to develop, and a kind of almost like a healing. I don't want to use words that I think are sometimes misused, but something happens again and again in terms of starting off with distance, anger, mistrust, a wall, and in the acceptance of that representational responsibility, something changes in that dynamic. So I'm very interested, even philosophically, thinking about theories of responsibility, but very practically, in terms of the kind of facilitation of different relationships in South Africa. I'm trying to convey something also to my fellow white South Africans, and even to younger white South Africans, including my children who are in their late 20s, and who are not always finding it easy to be white in South Africa today. But I'm trying to convey something of the humanizing potential of accepting representative responsibility, which goes beyond a legalistic causality. It goes beyond a sort of economic focus just on benefits and the sharing of benefits. It's a profoundly relational, humanizing kind of responsibility, which has the potential to restore, I think, some of our relationships. So that there's something in that I would love to explore academically, but definitely I'm using in constructive ways, I think, in some of the facilitation work that I'm doing. The last point I just want to talk a little bit about is the relationship between those two figures. I don't want to go into too much theology, but I mean, in terms of the Christian tradition, the person with the real power is the person on the cross. Ironically, paradoxically. It's not the Roman soldier with the spear. And again and again and again, that's been my experience. earlier in the 90s and the 80s when I became involved with the ANC and moved away from my own kind of community and family. I've experienced that many times. And in the last few years, moving back into South Africa, again engaging with people, trying to, I suppose, deal with the legacy of apartheid, I've experienced again and again a remarkable generosity of spirit amongst many black South Africans. I would not use the language of forgiveness. I think that's being used and abused by white South Africans. But the generosity of spirit, a kind of, Archbishop Tutu and many others use the language of Ubuntu. This idea that I'm constituted in relationship with the other. And a willingness almost to welcome and accept me into a relational journey, even though I really don't deserve that. And even though I represent a lot of pain and represent a family associated with a lot of pain. With a bit of humility, a bit of acknowledgement, and a willingness to go on a journey of restitution together, there's a generosity and there's a welcome, which for me is remarkable. And what happens, and this is what I find interesting about also some of the literature around the legacy of war and the legacy of people involved in violence, is that spear actually has two sharp points. Because as the spear is going into the side of the in this case, the black South African, there's another side to the spear which goes into the person holding the spear. And the language being used is that of moral injury. Don't know if you've come across that or if that's part of the discourse here, but it's being used increasingly to talk about what is the moral impact on the person using, or the human, psychological, spiritual impact on the person involved in violence. And that what is needed is also a healing of that injury. And this is what I've now experienced again and again in the current South African context. When I'm willing to enter honestly and humbly into a relational journey of restitution, something deep in me is also healed. Like, language is clumsy, but something, there's a lightening, there's a sense of becoming more human. And it makes that kind of classic Christian imagery a bit more real also, even though it's been used and abused in so many ways. So there's definitely something about, again, speaking to younger white South Africans, speaking to my fellow Afrikaans-speaking South Africans, there's something about trying to find the language to invite people into a process rather than just morally condemn them for their continuing racism, which is not actually very effective to change people. So how do I find the language? And black South Africans are saying this to us. You need to do that work. We are tired of becoming angry to expose whites to the reality of the ongoing legacy of apartheid. What are you as a white South African willing to do to raise historical awareness, to make people aware? And then the challenge is, what language do I use? What kind of process would I use to take people on a journey to get to the point where they begin to face the truth of that image, where they move from that spot to this spot? And this is really, for me, been the challenge lately. Is without rejection of family, without rejection of community. And ironically, a number of black South Africans have said to me, in our culture, we respect our ancestors. We're not asking you to reject your grandfather. The question is, what are you willing to do with your life, really? So the language that I find very attractive and trying to use when I work with people in South Africa is to say there's something profoundly true about Ubuntu. There's something profoundly true about the person who used the metaphor of the rainbow, not in a superficial sense, but in a radical, humanizing sense of including every human being. Something about we are different precisely in order to realize our need of one another. My humanity is caught up, is inextricably bound up in yours. And I think that's true in my experience, at least. But that truth, I think, in my experience, again, is dependent on the humility and the acknowledgement with which I enter into the relationship with black South Africans today, especially young black South Africans, where there's much more impatience, much more anger. So the language, I think, is something around becoming fully human, coming home in your skin, in your blood, come alive, be real, live an authentic, rooted life in South Africa, we have to go through on this journey of restitutional responsibility, as white South Africans in particular. If we don't go on this journey and we go into our protected spaces, behind our walls, behind all our, pointing our fingers to the shortcomings of the Zuma government and all the problems with the current ANC leadership, we can do that. But in the process, we are missing out on a humanizing journey of authentic relationships across the racial divide. But for that to happen, we need to face our restitutional responsibility. So, and then the rainbow, I don't know if that would make the rainbow shine in a unproblematic sense. I think the rainbow is a bit of a fluffy image, but for Archbishop Tutu, when he uses that language, it comes from a lifetime of radical inclusivity and struggle against that system. It does not come cheap. But people using it today, and white South Africans who are very comfortable with that image and who are not committed to the journey of real reconciliation, are actually delegitimizing that language in the eyes of young black South Africans. So we're also responsible for that we struggle today to use those images from that time because of the way we've cheapened and superficialized them. So that's why I think the language of responsibility, restitution, real reconciliation, deep reconciliation, radical inclusivity, that's the kind of language that I think we need to explore if we want to maintain the gains we've made in 1994. If we're not, I am quite worried that the center might not hold much longer in South Africa. Thank you.